Well, hi everyone, and we're really excited to have everyone here for the Sustaining Ash Partners Network kickoff webinar. I'm Rachel Swanek. I'm the Northeast Program Manager with the Forest Stewards Guild, and I'm going to begin by providing some background about the network. I'm going to announce our project goals and objectives, and then we're going to open it up with talks. We've got 4 great talks from speakers, and then we're going to also have Q&A. After the talks, we're going to move into some breakout groups where you'll have the opportunity to discuss ash protection with folks in your local area and your local state. So during the webinar, we ask that you stay muted unless you're specifically called on to unmute. That's just going to help everything run smoothly. And a recording of the meeting is going to be shared with participants, both through email and on our website after the webinar. So before we get started, I want to offer a land acknowledgement. The lands at the core of our network and that many of us presently inhabit in the Northeast sit on the ancestral homelands and waterways of the region's indigenous peoples. We acknowledge that these peoples have been stewards of these lands since time immemorial, and we are grateful for their continued stewardship and care for this place. For these tribal nations, issues of sovereignty, territorial rights, and access to sacred sites are ongoing, and we acknowledge that these tribal nations are inherently sovereign nations. We want to recognize the painful impacts of settler colonialism that attempted to remove these tribal nations from their homelands and erase their cultures. Despite these truths, the tribal nations of this region endure, and their stories and lessons continue to offer pathways towards a healthier world for future generations. SAP-Ne is committed to working towards understanding this legacy and building cross-cultural connections that celebrate the vibrancy, knowledge, and adaptability of these tribal nations. And with that acknowledgement, I'm going to jump in to giving a little bit of background about the network. So what is the Sustaining Ash Partners Network, or SAP-Ne? So SAP-Ne is a network that's funded through an agreement with the Forest Stewards Guild, excuse me, and the Eastern Region of the Forest Service under the Landscape Scale Restoration Program, which was awarded in 2023. Our network was developed in response to the devastating impact of emerald ash borer, a non-native insect that threatens to eliminate ash from our forests. The loss of ash across the landscape will have really devastating ecological, economic, social, and cultural impacts. The losses will be particularly felt by Indigenous peoples for whom black or brown ash is a cultural keystone species, known for its really important role in basket making ceremonies and oral traditions. And you're going to hear a lot more about that from our speakers coming up. I also want to mention that our efforts with the network focus on all ash species in the region, not just black or brown ash, but that has a particular cultural importance. So given a pressing need to encourage landscape level response to emerald ash borer, SAP-Ne supports a collaborative effort to sustain ash across the Northeast by building off of ongoing partnerships and collaborations to help develop more cross-boundary connections across the region between tribal nations, government agencies, researchers, private organizations, and diverse forest stewards. So that might include Indigenous knowledge holders, youth, contractors, private landowners, full host of folks. For the purposes of the grant, we're focusing our efforts on places where ash is both culturally significant and also where EAB is still in the early phases of infestation. So those places include present-day Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, and New York. And it also includes the lands of the federally recognized sovereign tribal nations throughout this region. EAB is too large of an issue for any one agency, group, tribal nation, or landowner to address on their own. So regional, cross-agency, cross-cultural, intertribal efforts are going to be really paramount to addressing this problem. As more states and tribal nations shift from limiting spread of EAB to actively trying to respond to active infestations, a unified approach across the region is really more important than ever if we want to sustain ash on the landscape for future generations. So what are our objectives? We're still in the launch phase, but we have 4 primary objectives. The first is to encourage stewardship approaches that honor the cultural values of ash and the connected relationships with Indigenous partners and sovereign tribal nations more broadly. Our second objective is to offer workshops and webinars like this one, our first launch webinar, through coordinated partnership to retain ash on the landscape throughout the project period. Our third is to establish a network of demonstration areas across state lands in the Northeast. So some of these treatments might include silvicultural approaches, insecticide treatments, biological controls, trying to highlight that across the region. These sites are in the process of being selected, and they'll be used as areas for education and outreach on ash protection. And our fourth objective is to develop a web hub to share resources on ash, on related events, on the research developments, and ash management more broadly in the Northeast. We're also going to be monitoring the efficacy of the network and its proposed actions, and our outreach to optimize our impact and to help streamline ash protection across the region. Who is SAP-Ne? So while SAP-Ne is administered by the Forest Steward Guild, we are made up of a growing network of partners. So on our website, I've listed all the partners, but for the sake of the presentation, I've put some of our key partners up here. So some of our partners include the Ash Protection Collaboration across Wabanakik, the St. Regis Mohawk Tribe, UVM, UMaine, UMass Amherst, the Forest Service. We're partnered with various state agencies across the region, the Nature Conservancy in Maine and Vermont, the Vermont Land Trust, the Appalachian Trail Conservancy, the Ecological Research Institute, and the Wild Seed Project. This network was SAP-Ne and broadly was developed in collaboration with all of our great partners, and we're really grateful to all of our partners and being able to continue growing this effort across the region. Our goal is to ultimately support a community of partners across the region who are committed to keeping ash on the landscape for future generations. If you have questions about the network or you want to learn more, we probably have some time to field a couple questions now, but you're also welcome to screenshot this, and I can also put my email in the chat, and we could also discuss different ways that folks might want to get involved with the network. Thanks. I don't know if there's any immediate questions about the network that anyone wanted to ask in the chat. I can kind of give it a little bit, see if any questions come up, and then if not, we can move on to talks. So Connecticut is not, so in terms of what states are part of the network, I mentioned Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, and New York. So those are states where we're going to have some demonstration areas and that are kind of part of this LSR under the Forest Service funding. So Connecticut is not directly part of the network, but all that to say that I think there's a lot of opportunities for knowledge and education across states that might not be listed there. So getting those different perspectives and engaging with organizations and groups outside of those primary states, I think is still a really important part of the work that we're doing. Okay, I think we'll move on to talks. And again, if any questions come up, I'll put my email in the chat, so feel free to reach out to me. So our first talk, we're going to have two talks. I'll just give kind of how it's going to work. So we'll have two talks and then a Q&A. So save the question, they're going to be at the end of the talks, and we'll kind of facilitate that through the chat. So as questions come up, feel free to put them in the chat. Our first two talks are going to be providing some background on scientific frameworks and Indigenous perspectives and values on sustaining ash. Our first speaker is Dr. Tony D'Amato. Tony is a professor, director of the Forestry program, and director of research forests at the University of Vermont. His research interests center on evaluating the efficacy of traditional and experimental silvicultural strategies to meet the increasingly diverse range of forest management objectives on public, private, and tribal lands. Tony also has a demonstrated and sustained commitment to building cross-cultural relationships with tribal nations across his research, and he continues to elevate tribal priorities in his work. And I'll hand it over to Tony. Thanks.
Thanks, Rachel, and thanks for the great turnout. Really wonderful to see many names in the chat that I've intersected with as it relates to thinking about ash and its future on the landscape, as well as some additional folks I've never met, but appreciate everybody coming together. So as Rachel mentioned, really my goal for this short presentation is just to talk a bit about some of the underlying genesis of this project, and then some thoughts that came from a group of us working on thinking about the future of ash in ways that we might frame how we go about preserving that species on the land, different species of ash in the landscape. And certainly there'll be many examples of that in action via some of the other presentations and discussions today. So I want to acknowledge this work really is a collaborative effort via various tribal nations, universities, conservation organizations. Two of the names on here, Amanda Mahaffey and Logan Johnson, were with the Forest Stewards Guild when we began this work. They're now both with Fish and Wildlife Service and Maine Tree, respectively. But just want to acknowledge that several years ago, many of us were coming together along with the Guild to think through how do we kind of move forward with our approaches to sustaining ash into the future, while also grappling with the impacts of emerald ash borer on the landscape. And so a lot of this work really came from what many of you even are doing today, in that we have this unfortunate region for gathering the emerald ash borer, but I guess the positive is that it's bringing together many perspectives, diverse worldviews, many tribal nations, many agencies, many universities, all collectively coming together, and importantly, as Rachel mentioned, sharing information on how do we address this threat. And as Rachel pointed out, and I saw some folks logging in that are from the Lake States region and even parts of New York and Pennsylvania and elsewhere, where a lot of mature ash has been killed. In the Northeast, really it's just beginning to manifest itself in terms of mortality of ash across the landscape. And so many of us were beginning to think through, we've been talking about adapting the emerald ash borer, talking about maybe managing for different species, but are there ways for us to actually preserve that species, both in material form and in traditions, but also as living trees on the landscape? And so what I'll be talking about is a framework that was developed by the authors that were on introductory screen, just to kind of help guide if we're going to be doing this, and many of you are, and we'll see some examples both at the end of this presentation and through some of the conversations today. If you are going to be scaling these preservation efforts, across states and across tribes and across regions, how do we do that in a way that really is thinking about what are the core values that we're trying to sustain across the landscape? And so I'm going to go through just a basic framework, and then, as I mentioned, let others today really talk about how that is being applied in their own work. So as all of us appreciate, since emerald ash borer was detected in Canada and in the US, there's been a lot of work that's focused in on how to keep ash alive. And I actually want to credit as well individuals like Benedict, Richard David, that long before emerald ash borer were already pioneering ways to collect ash seed and propagate ash, and so really build and sustain the species. And so there were a lot of opportunities to learn from whether it was the use of biocontrols, insecticides, silvicultural treatments, preservation of cultural materials, but many of us were feeling that there was a need to maybe think about this more holistically. We know how to keep a street tree alive, et cetera, but can we think about what would that look like if we do that over large forested landscapes, and what would be guiding, our approach to that? And so what we came up with was a general framework for species preservation that I'm just going to go through and enumerate kind of the four core values of that. And then again, we'll see some examples of application in a little bit. But essentially, if we're going to take the steps to preserve ash, both again in the forest, in our traditions, stockpiling splints, whatever the action that you are doing, it's worth thinking through. What really is the primary purpose that we're approaching this preservation with, and how can that either have complementarity with other values or application across different portions of the landscape. And so we identified kind of four core preservation values that one might use to guide their activities as it relates to the different ash species we care about. The first being ethical responsibility, the second, cultural integrity, the third, ecological function, and the fourth, genetic conservation. And this diagram on the right just kind of highlights those, but shows that, these overlapping circles on the outside indicate that many values, depending on how you're approaching preservation, can be met with any given action. But often there's one or two that are really guiding, why we're doing things out there. And so I'm going to go through and just briefly define kind of how we're viewing these values, mention just a brief framework, and then, like I said, allow others to talk a bit about both the cultural importance of this work as well as how people are applying it across the landscape. And so the first piece of this, when we think about introducing insects and pathogens and other challenges that face our landscape, as we think a little bit about just adaptation in general, many of us, if we think about our view of our relationships with the forest, we really have this responsibility to maintain that dynamic among beings in the forest. And so as it comes with emerald ash borer and the threat that EAB poses, preserving ash and preserving all that it provides really is honoring the many gifts that ash provides us in the natural world. And so trying to kind of fulfill that obligation to other beings out there in the forest. At the same time, if we just think about why emerald ash borer is here, why we are seeing threats of these different species, just ethically, we are the reason why we are addressing these challenges. And so ethically, we have a responsibility when we can to try to minimize those impacts and sustain native species across the landscape. At the same time, as Rachel mentioned, and as all of you appreciate, when it comes to the loss of a species or a threat of a tree species, fundamentally, the first thing we should be thinking about is the importance of that species from a cultural perspective. And brown ash is one of many species that holds deep cultural value to the tribes across our region. And so when we're going and thinking about preserving a species or preserving the traditions tied to that species, really trying to make sure we're maintaining that cultural integrity, both in the forest, so maintaining kind of the relationships that we have with those living trees, as well as maintaining the relationships with those materials and those lifeways that are tied to that. At the same token, all of us appreciate that every tree species is distinctive, and many tree species have distinctive impacts on the ecological environment that they're growing within. And ash, really across all three of the main ash species we have in the Northeast, is no exception, whether it's the role of black ash and green ash in hydrologic regulation, floodplain maintenance, the role that all those species play in terms of the litter quality they produce. So it's a very high quality litter, which influences aquatic food webs, influences, soil nutrition out in the forest. They have unique leafing habits that certainly affect an upland forest, the amount of light that's received in a given point, as well as, in our upland rich northern hardwood forests, white ash becomes the largest tree species in those ecosystems. So it provides just unique values in terms of being this large tree that really can both from a carbon as well as habitat standpoint, provide values that many other species do not. And then finally, the last piece, and certainly many of you are aware of efforts tied to this, certainly some of the MAMA work and other work that the Forest Service is doing, is just trying to identify individual species that either show resistance or just protecting individual species with the hope of resistance so that we can be kind of breeding specific genotypes that might be able to sustain EAB in the landscape. And so trying just to keep that genetic resource across the region. So as I mentioned, we'll certainly get into talking a bit about how people are doing this in the Northeast through some of the presentations today. But really the way that this might guide how you approach preservation really will influence like what approaches you use and what strategies, depending on what value you're actually trying to achieve with preserving that species. And so as a simple example, if my goal is to actually preserve the ecological function of ash in the forest, so I need to be maintaining living trees, I'm going to be taking strategies and approaches that actually are doing things to deliberately maintain health and vigor of ash. So that might be insecticide treatments, it might be biocontrols, and in many cases, often it's an integration of many. And so using integrated pest management to try to keep that species alive and influencing that ecosystem and providing those functions that would be lost if we lose that species. What's been really powerful, and I think what's motivated so much of this work, and I'll certainly confess, when I first was working in Minnesota in 2009, when emerald ash borer first showed up in that state, a lot of discussion was we can't treat trees at large scales in the forest. That's really an urban context. We really can't do large scale preservation strategies. But what we've seen, and certainly Caitlin Cusack's on the call and can talk about this, in Vermont, in New Hampshire, in Maine, in many places, the scale of effort that's happening to keep mature ash, as well as the scale of effort that's happening to collect seed and learn from Les and others on how to do that, pound splints and do many other things to make sure we're sustaining both the species as well as its diverse values has been really humbling and pretty incredible. And so these couple of maps up here, again, Caitlin can talk more about this in a little bit, but just to work the Vermont Land Trust, Appalachian Trail Conservancy, Equinox Preservation Trust doesn't even include the 36 sites that Green Mountain National Forest is treating in Vermont. The one on the right is a subset of the White Mountain National Forest and the scale of preservation happening just within that ownership. And so it's been, I think, a pretty amazing kind of collection of effort across the region that hopefully we can continue to build upon through this network and through the efforts of many on this webinar. So I'll acknowledge there's lots of folks that continue to teach me and motivate me about thinking outside the box in terms of preserving ash, and certainly look forward to Les and others sharing their perspectives and how they're going about doing this in the region. So I'll pass the baton. I'll stop sharing and let Les take over here.
Great. Thank you, Tony. And just a reminder, if you have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, and you can also address them to a specific speaker, and we can make sure that we try and get that asked. All right, so our next speaker is Richard Silliboy, the Vice Chief of the Micmac Nation and an esteemed basket maker who comes from a family of basket makers that goes back several generations. Richard started making baskets when he was just a young child with his family, and his continued work as a basket maker is an essential part of keeping this cultural practice and relationship with ash trees alive for future generations. Today, Richard's work is highly sought after, and he's even very well known for making the world's largest potato basket, which was measured at over 7 feet tall. Richard, want to get started?
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you, Tony. Nice display of baskets, by the way. Anyways, it's I'm glad to be here today. And the importance of brown ash to to the Native Americans of Maine, it's just something else, because it's been part of our culture and the economy as far as that goes, and for many, many years. We started swapping baskets with the Europeans when they came over, and used that for barter for metal tools and stuff like that. So, it's always been important to us to maintain a good stand of brown ash. And my mother, when she was raising us, lots of times she didn't have a permanent place to live, and if she would come across the stand of brown ash, she would put up a shelter right there with her and the kids, and she'd make baskets right there as long as that brown ash lasted, and then she'd move on, somewhere else. But Mother Aroostook County used to be the potato capital of the world at one point in time, and they grew 250,000 acres of potatoes. And if they grew 150 barrels per acre, that was 37,500,000 barrels of potatoes, which had to be harvested in 6 weeks. The frost would kill the tops, but they had to harvest all those potatoes before the deep frost in late October, early November. And it took approximately 20,000 people to harvest those potatoes in that short period of time. And each one of those potato pickers had to have a potato basket. And my mother and the boys used to make as many as 10 dozen baskets a week, 120 baskets a week, and sell those to some to the local farmers and some to hardware stores that would hold on to them and sell them to the farmers when the season started. But I've worked with Les Benedict at the Penobscot Nation, collecting seeds, and I've worked with Jennifer Neptune at different times to, observe seeds and see where we could collect them. My tribe, excuse me, my tribe collected seeds in, probably about 6 years ago. We took out a group of youth and our forester and a couple of the staff people, and we took out some tarps and laid tarps out around, and we, had Forestry. He was the strongest. He grabbed the tree and gave it a big shake, and the wind took all the seeds away from the tarp. We only had about 6 seeds on the tarp. But anyways, we gave it a good effort. My basket making didn't start until the mid 80s because as a youth, we worked so hard as children making baskets that I didn't want to do it anymore. And at 13, I swore I'd never make another basket until I seen that it was a dying art. And about 5 years after I started making, we seen the dieback that took place in the late 80s, early 90s. And we started collecting seeds back then. And I believe those were sent out to Colorado somewhere to a seed bank. And I was told that they got lost somehow, but anyways, with the brown ash baskets, brown ash is really pliable and strong after it dries. It'll dry like a bone. And, so recently, well, a few years ago, I cut a green ash by mistake. And that turned out to be a nice piece of wood. And this fall, well, this summer, I went out looking for ash, took a couple of people with me, and we ended up cutting 2 pieces of green ash in where I was cutting brown ash. And that turns out to be some of the best wood there is. That will split so true. Split that down. Tyler Everett was just up here a week or so ago, and we quartered the tree, and then I started taking the heart out of it and gave it to Tyler, and he pounded that wedge clear down through that 6-foot piece, and that stayed right in that grain, true all the way down through. So it's and also when I squared a stick off and ready to pound, it was quite thick. So I took a knife and I started from one end and just got into one grain and opened that up a little bit. And then I took my draw shave, and you could just pull that down through, and that would follow that one grain down. So actually, green ash is really, really good to work with baskets. And there's a lot of the fancy basket makers, they like a lot of white in their wood. And green ash has a lot of white compared to brown ash. And white is the sapwood of the tree, and the brown is the heartwood of the tree. So, anyways, I'm glad to be here with you, and it's good to see a big crowd here today. And if anybody has any questions, they could just, forward them to me. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Richard. I'll leave a little bit of time for questions if anyone wants to raise a hand or put a question in the chat. I can try and kind of keep an eye on that. Yeah, I've got a question. Richard, if you could talk a little bit more about your process for making a basket.
Yeah, I guess so. Well, we grew up making potato baskets because we live here in Aroostook County. And I'm the youngest of a larger family, and the older siblings would go out and get ash And whenever they went out, I had to go with them, being the youngest. I used to go as company, and then I would carry the wood out the way the men would. And anyways, I'd learned how to process the brown ash, and mother and I would make few brown ash baskets when the boys were gone, moved out or were doing something else. But I was really too young to go out and cut a lot of brown ash. So mother and I would go out and we'd cut a cedar tree, and we would split that down and the same way we did with the brown ash. But the only difference was you can't pound cedar the way we pound brown ash. You have to get that little plank that you have ready to and split that down the middle, and that'll split true on that grain. And then you go to the middle grain again and keep doing that until you're down to two splints. And anyway, she would make fancy baskets, and we would go door to door selling those. So at 12, 13 years old, when I thought I was really cool, I'd be walking around town with a half a dozen baskets on each arm. Everybody wanted to give the little Indian boy cookies and milk. I had a thirst for something else at that age. And anyways, the brown ash baskets that we made is something that always went to the field. So we weren't that fussy about how we made the brown ash baskets, because people are going to take them out in the field and they set on them and bang them against the barrel to knock the mud off and stuff like that. But when I started selling baskets for the tribe, I realized that they were all making the same basket. I was trying to sell to the public, and they were making them for the fields. So when I realized it was a dying art, I decided that I would put my basket on the table. As I said, I knew how to do that. And but the thing was, from what in my memory to the tip of my fingers, it just did not commute because my baskets, first few baskets I made, they looked like hell, and I tucked them away where nobody could see them. But as I practiced and continued to make them, I would try to improve. I would try to improve the process. I would try to speed up the process, because there's so many tasks in making baskets that it's almost impossible to go out and find the wood and prepare the wood and make the basket. It's so time consuming. And so anyways, I just try to speed up the process. I use mechanical tools and a mechanical pounder that I have, and that works pretty good. And the good thing about that is I don't have to stop and rest like I did when I was pounding by hand. And it's really really quite helpful, and it speeds up the process. And so anyways, when I make my basket, I try to make it so there is no sharp points sticking out. I want everything to be rounded and smooth, the handles and the rims. And I try to make sure that there is no little sliver sticking out of the splint somewhere where somebody could, pick their finger or something. So it's a process that, that I practice and I teach. When I teach people, I teach them to do it the proper way, so that they'll be satisfied with the basket they make. I also have students come up. I have students from Bowdoin, Bates, and Unity once, and It's always fun to work with young people that's here, that come here. And I put them to work. I'll start the basket, but they weave it up afterwards. And then I'll have them sign their name on the splint that they put in. Then when they leave, I'll finish off that basket and send it to the university where they come from. It's a lot of fun, but there's not much money in that day. So, anyways, you've seen some baskets there when Tony was speaking. I think I took those down to Tony, oh, geez, quite a few years ago now. But that still looks good. Very good looking basket you got there, Tony. I spotted that right off quick. If you need some more, give me a call. Anyways, that's about it.
Thank you. How
Yeah.
long can I ask how long it takes you from felling a tree to making a basket? How long is that process for you?
Well, I have to wait about 60 years for that tree to grow.
Mhm.
After that, it's only a few days. Now, sometimes we go out 2 days and find nothing. And I can't go out and tramp in the woods like I used to. So I just ride the back roads until I find something or I find a creek, you know, and then I'll follow that down, see if I can find some ash. With 15 heart attacks and defibrillator is fired 18 times, I try not to go too far from the truck. And about 10 years ago, I found a stick that was a little ways off road, and I said, well, I can't carry it, but I can upend it. And about a month later, I went to see my doctor, and he says, what was you doing on such and such a date? And I told him I was out looking for ash, and he says, well, your defibrillator got ready to fire. And I was about 5 miles in the woods all by myself, no cell phone. There wouldn't have been no service there anyway. So I'm very careful. I try not to go out alone anymore. You know, I can still cut the tree down. I can still select it, but I can't carry it out. So I take people like Tyler. He's a big, rugged young fella. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Richard, and thank you, Tony. And maybe speakers, I know there's a couple questions we didn't get to. Can try and answer something in the chat. With those talks, we're going to move on to our next two talks. So our next two speakers are going to be sharing case study examples of their efforts stewarding ash. And same kind of format, Q&A, put your questions in the chat. Our first speaker for this portion is Caitlin Cusack. Caitlin is a licensed forester with the Vermont Land Trust. Previously, she worked as an urban and community forestry extension educator for the University of Vermont and was a conservation forester with the Vermont Family Forests. In her current role, Caitlin manages woodlands owned by the Land Trust, stewards conservation easements, and provides technical assistance to landowners and staff. She also serves on the steering committee for the Guild's Women Owning Woodlands program and is dedicated to promoting practices that help forests adapt and become more resilient to a changing environment. Caitlin?
Thanks so much, Rachel. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm going to just share my screen now. Let's see. Hang on, sorry. Let me try this again. Okay, there we go. How's that? Is that good?
That looks great. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks. I'm just going to turn off my video to save a little bandwidth. Thanks again, everyone. So I've been asked today to briefly share about some work happening in Vermont. So in Vermont, there are several nonprofit and public partners who are concerned about the future of ash. who have started protecting groves of ash trees within a forested setting. You may hear folks refer to these as preservation patches as well. And one of our main goals is to conserve the genetic diversity of ash. And Tony kind of shared kind of some of those overarching goals with us earlier. And I just wanted to mention, this strategy can really complement silvicultural strategies as well. And it's based on the research of Flower et al., who investigated the genetic diversity of white ash trees across the Allegheny National Forest. And many of you know that's in northwestern Pennsylvania. And their goal through that research was to identify optimal strategies for preserving genetic diversity. And they found, that it's better to treat more populations with less trees per population as opposed to fewer sites with more trees per site. And really, protecting these numerous populations has that added advantage of protecting against losses caused by disturbances, like we know, like wind here in the Northeast. I do want to give a big shout out to Bill Davidson, who I think I saw his name on the list here. New Hampshire has been a real leader in this work, and has been treating ash trees across the state for several years now. Bill, with the New Hampshire Department of Forest Health, he's been a really great resource, and fielded many of my calls and emails to learn more about how they were doing this in New Hampshire. I also want to, thank Nate Siegert, who's with the U.S. Forest Service, and Tony, who have also been really helpful to guiding our work here in Vermont. And just finally to mention that the pesticide we're using is emamectin benzoate, and we use the ArborJet trunk injection system. There's also another system that other folks are using called the Rainbow system, but we're using ArborJet, and it is a restricted use pesticide. So one does need a pesticide applicator's license in order to apply it. So here's a map just showing all the different partners and where these groves are being treated across the state. So in 2021, the Land Trust received funding from the U.S. Forest Service to purchase the ArborJet equipment. It's not cheap, it's about $3,000. And that equipment was shown in that previous photo. And we started treating groves of 12 to 20, mostly white ash, because that's just what we had on our properties, but some black ash trees on 10 of the lands that we own, and those are shown in yellow. We've been targeting small to large saw timber sized trees. And two of these sites I mentioned, these preservation patches can be a nice strategy in tandem with silvicultural strategies. We did have on two of these sites conducted forest management projects where one of the goals was to regenerate ash. So you'll see in the kind of darker blue, Tony mentioned the Forest Service in collaboration with the Appalachian Trail Conservancy. They've treated 4 sites now, and that's been between 40 and 100 trees at 4 of those sites. And, I also want to say the ATC has done a lot of work in the Southern Appalachians and then in Western Massachusetts doing this work as well. And so they're kind of a foreigner as well. And then you'll see the Nature Conservancy, that's our sites in orange. They just started treating 2 of their preserves this year. The be there is TNC also has on the preserves a lot of black and green ash, so they're able to preserve some of the genetics of those species as well by participating. They plan to treat up to 6 preserves. And then I think I saw Rick Ledoux with the Equinox Preservation Trust. That is the kind of lavender color in southwestern Vermont. They also treated trees. And then finally, of our nonprofit partners, the Vermont Institute of Natural Science, that is the red dot in the kind of western edge border with New Hampshire. Last year, they treated about 12 trees, including some large diameter ones. And then Tony mentioned the U.S. Forest Service has treated 36 stands. So that's just so folks know, that's kind of up the spine of the southern greens. That's that kind of lighter blue color right there. Whoops. There we go. So I thought I would just end with just kind of sharing just some quick details on kind of how we're doing this. And again, this was kind of Bill Davidson was super helpful in helping us think about, spacing and what trees we should be looking at. So really, at a minimum, it's only necessary to treat 12 to 15 trees kind of per site. I know the Forest Service in some places is treating up to 30 trees. VLT in some areas treated up to 20. But really looking at sort of within a 1 to 3 acre area. Having the trees closer together, it increases cross-pollination between those treated trees and really creates a single concentrated ash seed bank rather than, several dispersed ones. Um, so it's important to select the healthiest, vigorous trees. It can be advantageous to choose mostly females, so that you really can preserve as many good seed trees as possible. Optimal application is in the spring. That coincides with flowering and leaf expansion, and that really helps to distribute the chemical well and controls both the larva of emerald ash borer and the adult beetles. So in summary, just we're committed to treating, all these partners are really committed to treating these trees as long as needed, so that we do have sites with populations of naturally reproducing ash and where seed can be collected in the future, which is kind of both part of providing the basis for adaptation and then future restoration. And this is just, one example of many that we've heard and will hear today about how we can invest in the future of ash.
Thank you, Caitlin. So our last but certainly not least speaker is Les Benedict. Les is a member of the St. Regis Mohawk tribe and has been the Assistant Director for the Tribal Nations Environment Division for over 30 years. Les has been a pioneering voice leading a commitment to address concerns about the health of ash trees held by his tribal community for decades. He co-authored the Handbook for Black Ash, Preservation, Reforestation, and Regeneration, and continues to be a leading advocate for black ash and black or brown ash conservation work, bridging Western science and Indigenous knowledge while engaging diverse partners across the region.
Thank you very much. I consider it a privilege to be part of this partnership and to be able to share the successes that we've had. It seems like it was just yesterday. I think we're in a good position here. 30 some years ago, we probably could have filled one file folder with all of the information that was available about black ash. There was information about other ash as well, but so much has come about, unfortunately, as a result of emerald ash borer. I'm just overwhelmed with and amazed by all of the work and effort that's gone into this, into preserving ash. Initially, the call in our community was to bring ash back to our own community because our people were going further and further away to collect ash. And that's all it was at that time, was just to learn about the tree, to learn how we can bring the tree back into our community. It definitely wasn't an emergency type response to where we're trying to salvage what we can because of the emerald ash borer impacts. I'd like to reflect on a couple things as I go through about what success was to us, but I just want to acknowledge all of those that have contributed to my understanding of ash and the understanding of the forest relationships with ash. I wanted to comment on Richard. It's always great to see Richard Silliboy. We have another Richard here in our community whom Richard really knows well. They're both elders. The Wabanaki story about black ash and where it came from is certainly reflective of what Richard Silliboy was talking about the tree being pliable and strong and resilient. That's one of the things that you'll find about the Native American tribes and indigenous peoples. We're here today. We're very fortunate to be here today to be able to continue our own journey through life and to be able to encourage our youth to continue. Richard Silliboy in particular is more than just a basket maker. For those who learn about him as you go on, he's actually a tribal leader. He's been there talking about and supporting Native rights. So he's a very humble person. There's things he doesn't necessarily talk about, but I've come to know him as a very important tribal leader in his community. Same with Richard David in our community. So I would like to acknowledge them. Tony D'Amato, in his presentation, talked about something. He talked about relationships, relationships within the forest. And when our community holds meetings or discussions, we have what we call the words that come before all else. And the world, it's considered a prayer, but it's not really a prayer. It's more of an acknowledgement of the natural world. And it goes from acknowledging the people, all of you that came here today to have this discussion, and taking the time out to be part of this process. But it also acknowledges all of the different aspects of our natural world, not putting human beings above that natural world, but having a relationship and understanding how those relationships work and the importance of those relationships and how they sustain us. So I certainly appreciate those thoughts regarding the relationships. And that's kind of what I'm going to be talking about today, is partnerships and relationships, and how that was important for us to sustain our, I guess, our effort to preserve black ash. I was introduced as being with the St. Regis Mohawk tribe, but I'm also with the Akwesasne Task Force on the Environment. I actually got the call to work with black ash a number of years ago. We were sitting around a table and we're working on a number of different community initiatives, and I was fresh out of university, and I had a lot of interest in plants. So when the topic of black ash came up, that's the project that I selected, and I haven't stopped since. I've tried to retire a few times, but I keep getting pulled back into it. So I guess it's more than a job. It's really a passion, and I really enjoy being a part of this. It's taking me to different parts of the nation in Canada as well. Some of the greatest joy that I've had is meeting with other tribal nations and First Nations to learn more about what's going on in their community, and to learn about how they make baskets, and to learn about some of their struggles that they have and how they've been able to overcome some of those challenges that they faced. And we're in a position in New York State where we're kind of in the middle. The Great Lakes states and the Anishinaabe people were first hit hard with emerald ash borer, and they're still in our minds, and they're still very active with working with us, working with various state and federal partners to try to resolve this issue. But it was more than a dozen years ago. It was very disheartening to see the damage that was taking place with ash, and I did not think that I would ever see the day when it came here. And unfortunately, it is here. We're beginning to see the damage, and it sometimes seems hopeless. But when we think about the resilience and the strength and the flexibility and the endurance of our tribal nations, then I think about how we've built a lot of partnerships and how we can continue to be successful and come out of this some way. And I'm very encouraged by the fact that many of the people that are on this participating in this webinar and future webinars are taking up that challenge, and a lot of good information is coming out of the studies that are being done, and some on the field work, like with the Vermont Land Trust, with their efforts to preserve what they can to ensure that there will be some ash left for the future. So I just wanted to let you know, for those who aren't familiar with the Haudenosaunee, they also call it, or they call it, in this map, it's called Haudenosaunee Iroquois territory, but Haudenosaunee is actually the people of the Longhouse. Iroquois is another term that were used by other people to describe us. But this is our native territory. It was very expansive. We have much less than that is now. And we actually had some interactions, a lot of interactions with the Wabanaki and the Abenaki tribes and other tribes, the Mohegan tribes. A lot of these maps, they look very static, but they're not. The relationships were very dynamic, and there was a lot of trade that occurred between the different nations. So this is our reservation now. It's just a little postage stamp on the upper part of New York State. When people ask where you're from, I say, well, I live in New York State. They think of the city, which is like 400 miles south of us down here, Long Island. I'm actually closer to Canada. In fact, our community is split by the border. We're an international community. For those who might have that interest. And this gives a little bit better depiction of Akwesasne, and the shading represents what people call the U.S. portion and the Canadian portion. And we have a lot of resources. We have a lot of water resources and wetlands where ash occurs. I just want to touch on a few things. I'm not going to get deep into this. I've got a lot of photos to share, and this presentation will be made available for those who would like a copy of that. So basically, a partnership is an agreement between people to work together, and the key elements for those are having some proactive type ownership in the goals and objectives that we're working towards, a system of mutual accountability, a true commitment to what we're doing, focus on a shared goal, and I'm going to really key in on focus on a shared goal, clear measured expectations, balanced rewards, so everybody receives some sort of reward from this relationship, and a continuous action plan, which I'm seeing. The information, the best part of a plan is not the fact that you have a written plan or some type of plan developed, but you're continuously improving and adapting. And that's what the response to EAB required. It required continual improvement, and then comparable reputations. So our goal initially was going from seed to plant container to the ground, raising a tree. Richard mentioned, how long does it take to go from tree to a basket? And he mentioned 60 years. It does take a very long time for this tree to go. So in order to become to the point where you can harvest it and then turn it into a basket. Our initial relationship and partnership was with the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation at the Brazier State Forest, which is about 15 miles south of our reservation. Initially, it was called the Adopt a Natural Resource program, and then it evolved into a volunteer stewardship agreement. And that primarily was carried not by the St. Regis Mohawk tribe, but by the Akwesasne Task Force on the Environment. And the reason that happened was that it provided a community base for establish an agreement. It was apolitical, it remains apolitical, and it focused on the technical aspects, focused on the cultural aspects of working with black ash. We've had multiple partners throughout this entire process. We've had SUNY ESF Ranger School, USDA Animal Plant Health Inspection Service, USDA U.S. Forest Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Saratoga Tree Nursery, which is part of New York State DEC, Maine Indian Basket Alliance, and our partners with the University of Maine. The Brazier State Forest in particular, I call it my lab. And when I tell people I'm going to my lab, they think I'm going to another room or whatever. But actually, this has not just been a technical lab, it's also been a lab for, I guess, partnership. I think of all the field meetings that we had. All of our field meetings consisted of some sort of meeting in a field, and it always involved food and people contributing to that. To me, that was like one of the most exciting times, to be able to share information, enjoy a meal, and actually to be immersed in that type of an environment. And I think that was one of the key reasons that people enjoyed working with this project, is because of all the great food that people brought. But this particular site, I called the lab, provided a lot of information in advance of EAB. Like I said, we've never even considered emerald ash borer. Since we started this, it's provided a lot of valuable data that's now being used for EAB response. It's provided a place for seed collections that allow us long-term storage of seeds. we've learned a lot about silvicultural treatments. And now it's a site for EAB response activities, the use of parasitoid wasps and the use of ammonectin benzoate as a pesticide. It's allowed us to learn about habitats and all of the other relationships that ash has with other plants and animals and organisms. And it's inspired research that's been done by others. And these are just a collection. I've gone through some of my photos, and I have I probably have thousands of photos, and it's difficult to choose which ones to put into a presentation. But these are just representative of some of the activities that have taken place as a result of the what I call the journey. I'm surprised this video is playing. It's supposed to be static, but this is actually the late Henry Arquette, who was an elder who taught hundreds of people to make baskets, and he's explaining to the state forester how to check a tree. Checking a tree is the process of harvesting a tree. I might have mentioned this to a few people. Oftentimes people will cut down trees and try to pick out the tree that's best for basket making. The approach that our elders taught us is to check a tree, where we cut into the tree with an axe. So we don't harvest every tree and decide we're going to keep one. We actually check the living tree to make sure that it's suitable for basket making. And I think Richard can relate to that. So that tree is left there for the next generation of basket makers, and it's preserved to grow, to continue to grow and produce trees for the next generation. And we've actually encountered some of what I call legacy sites, where we can actually go back and visit some of the trees that were checked by Henry and others in our community, because it bears the mark, but you can see that the tree is healed over and has had no damaging effects to the tree. So that's what Henry was explaining. Just a few more photos of people that are involved with basket making. Richard David is on the lower right of the screen, and just some shots. And there's Richard Silliboy. So just over time, there's been a lot of projects, some of reforestation. We involved the New York State SUNY ESF Ranger School. We actually planted some trees in a isolated site in New York State a number of years ago. And these photos are historic now. The photo on the left is actually a person that my grandmother was friends with, and this photo was taken back in the early 80s, and she was probably in her 70s at that time. And so just some photos of the projects I've been involved with, including these of seed collection over the years with different nations. And many of the people that I met and that I've learned a lot. John Pigeon on the left from Maine. The lady in the center is the late Marita Skidders. She was actually, I'm thinking of her, I'm probably her age now. I don't want to reveal my real age, but anyways, I'm probably her age now at that time of the photo. But she was one of the first people in our community that was really encouraging us to move ahead and try to establish some stands back on the reservation. And this happens to be a seed orchard that we established back in 1993. And I think that photo was probably taken around 1998. And so there's been a lot of people that have been involved with this. Our elders encouraging us to bring the tree back and supporting us and teaching us the importance of the craft. It's very important to Native Americans. Black ash is very important. It's a medicine for people. When we mix 3 different types of elements with water, grasses, and trees, that constitutes a medicine for us. And there are a lot of other cultural aspects to talk about. Partnerships. I showed this. This is the covenant chain. It's a mutual agreement. This is actually one of the Haudenosaunee wampum belts that existed at the time that we first came into contact with the Europeans, and that it just symbolized that we would have our own lives and work, but we would be together and help one another if needed. So it's that particular partnership endures to this day, and it represents friendship, good minds, and peace. The Brazier State Forest is also, I'm going to call it intergenerational customer usage area for ash log harvesters and basket makers. It's not tribal land, but it's one of the areas that we've had influence on, and I was happy to be able to get into a partnership with New York State to be able to continue that, but not only just for harvesting, but for preserving black ash. And this particular site is ideal for black ash. I've had the privilege of knowing these foresters from New York State, and I would like to acknowledge them over the years: Dave Corse, Tim Baxter, Tony Sparacino, and Henry Field, who is current today. So looking ahead, we're looking at doing some wide area ash harvesting. That's actually, we just did a pilot project late last winter. Some of the problems we've encountered is not having enough snow and ice, because these areas are sensitive wetlands. So we harvest everything by hand. We do use some mechanical equipment, but they're low ground contact light equipment. And we want to continue to do seed collection. I would continue to encourage that. And we're working with USDA APHIS on a similar project to what the Vermont Land Trust is doing, is preserving the high value trees and the seed producers. And we're also involved with parasitoid wasp releases. So that's what we're doing now. In conclusion, the VSA is truly reflective of the mutual understanding of our shared goals between the partners, and it's that particular agreement and the effort with our partners has provided a lot of valuable data for ongoing pest management. And I just would like to say again, this spans a multi-generational, multi-career time frame, and I look forward to, I'm encouraged by efforts by students like Tyler Everett, River Matthew, Emily Francis, Ella McDonald, those that are continuing to learn and to support the efforts of the First Nations and tribal nations. And I would just like to thank you for this opportunity. This is my contact information, and be happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Les. So what's going to happen now is we're going to break up into groups by state, those states that are listed as part of the grant, and then also for those folks that are at states that are not part of that small northeastern region, but are still here and want to participate. And I also want to just acknowledge that the territories of these respective states are on the homelands of Indigenous peoples, and partnership between tribal nations and states is really important. And so that's kind of part of this process. So for our participants from sovereign tribal nations, I would encourage you to join the breakout session for the state where you personally feel that this partnership needs to be prioritized across your own sovereign lands. We're going to have breakout group leaders. I'm going to put all their information, although that doesn't look as good as it did in my document, but that's the names of all the breakout group leads. So real quick, for Vermont, Caitlin Cusack; for New York, Les Benedict. So if you have questions for Les or Caitlin, you can ask them in your breakout group. For Maine, Tyler Everett; for Massachusetts, Dr. David Orwig; for New Hampshire, Bill Davidson; and for nationally, all the states, Christian Nelson from the Guild is going to be coordinating that group. We're going to be in the breakout groups for about 10-ish minutes. And you're going to be able to talk about how you are working to protect ash in your region, and also what kind of resources you might need from SAP-Ne, from the network, and how we could better serve our community. Welcome back, everyone. I know that might have been short, and hopefully it wasn't too abrupt of an end. But I just want to take the last few minutes to kind of come back together as a group and have our breakout group leads give a brief, like 1 to 2 minute overview of just some key themes that came up in their discussions. And if this felt helpful to you to be able to talk amongst people in your local area, we could also like put something like this on again. So please share that feedback. Because I was like went around, it seemed like there were really great discussions happening. So let's start in Vermont. So Caitlin, do you want to give a little bit of a overview?
Sure. Yeah, we just were kind of on that first question about what's going on, and it was exciting to hear about some work that Forest and Parks, our state Forest and Parks has planned to do treatment of black ash on 30 different sites. Um, Rich Chalmers talked about how he has a MAMA, the monitoring ash mortality plot, and is starting to see mortality. So those plots, the goal is to identify lingering ash. That there's a private forest group, Longview, that has 6 landowners that have been treating sort of groves of ash and doing some silviculture with that, which was great to hear. And then Brookwood, the Intervale, talked about some of the seed collection they're doing and thinking about adding ash as to incorporate as part of their seed collection efforts they do annually for other riparian and restoration plantings. So yeah, great to hear of all the other work and definitely cut short. And another idea, Rachel, that we had talked about is maybe if we could have the emails of the folks in each breakout session so that we could even follow up individually afterwards to continue the conversation.
Yeah, we can definitely do that. I'll be sending out a survey at the end of this. So if you want to just check, I can put a box to say, yes, I'm comfortable having my email shared with other people on the call. We can do it that way. That's great. Thank you, Caitlin. Les?
Yes, we had a very good discussion. A couple main points that came out of the discussion include there was an interest in having some tools available that would assist land managers, state and private, with being able to provide, I guess, to have some management strategies post EAB. In one instance, there is some second growth coming back after EAB has been in an area, and they would really like to have some guidelines that would help them guide how to manage land post EAB. Another point was obtaining information with regard to parasitoid wasp treatments and how does that translate into underground efforts. How does that translate into ash survivability? I think they're interested in learning, when you release the wasp, and what impact does that have on that ash survivability, and how can that be used to help landowners make decisions. And then lastly, there was private landowner interested in knowing or understanding what they could do as a private landowner. And then our discussion with Cornell got cut off as we left the breakout room. So maybe if Cornell could forward their question in the chat, then maybe we could get a response to that later on.
Great, thanks. Tyler, Remain.
Yeah, we also had a great conversation. It was cut short, and I was not paying attention or being mindful of the timeline. So we made it through the first one, and then people have been eager to share, so they've added additional stuff to the other sticky notes. But on that first question, we heard from Kelsey Daigle at TNC, and across there, 300,000 acres in Maine. Some of the ash-dominated forests are being identified right now. So just finding where those ash trees are, and then while doing that, simultaneously checking for seed production, so that we can engage those forests for seed collection efforts. This year, we did talk, not a great seed year, and the seed that we have seen has been cast pretty early, and it's not generally viable, or very few are viable. So not a great year for seed collection, but it's great that we're finding trees producing seed, because hopefully they'll do it again in the future. Then we talked about a small preservation patch on TNC land in Georgetown, Maine, where 12 trees were injected with imamectin benzoate. So a little bit of seed collection and chemical treatments occurring there. And then Jake Mayer is a consulting forester in Orland, and there were two emerald ash borer beetles detected by a landowner that he was working with. Um, and then he also has been working with the 5-acre town forest, which has an ash dominance, and he's installed trap trees in the past, but a recent challenge has been you have to sacrifice a tree when you do a trap tree, and that was met with some opposition from the town. And so that's kind of a call to action, right? We need to share that the value of monitoring and getting those detections outweighs the sacrifice of a single tree for emerald ash borer detection. And I think that there has been some progress there with some new partners in Jake's effort. And then the Maine Forest Service has got some injection equipment purchased recently. In this past year, sites were selected based on the abundance of ash and the mature ash trees on site. And those sites were injected with also with imamectin benzoate. And they're hoping to add more sites next year. So that's exciting. And then Inland Fish and Wildlife here in Maine is monitoring and mapping brown ash. Jack Chapin commented. And they're focusing in that effort also in finding seed producing trees, not just for seed collection efforts, but also to avoid any harvest of female trees during their operations. So good best management practice being applied there. For resources, we talked about the Ash Protection Collaboration across Wabanagig, or APCA, in our webpage, which I did throw that in the chat at one point. So feel free to check that out and join our mailing list. The Forest Stewards Guild, the Society of American Foresters. We also threw in the Maine Forest Service webpage, especially for detections of emerald ash borer and the latest on quarantine updates. And then information and resources that are needed, continuing to do seed collection trainings. And I can second that. I feel like every time we do a seed collection training, it always gets a lot of participation, and it's always new folks who are learning it for the first time and realizing how important it can be. Logan mentioned outreach to private family forest owners for identifying those ash sites so that we can start to develop some response strategies. Outreach to large landowners like timber companies was mentioned by Ella, especially in the northern part of the state. We've talked about the seed collection and in the kits that we outline in our manual. It'd be great if there was a checkout system where these kits were available across the state, so folks that find seed can just check out that kit and collect seed. I was at a recent talk and people talked about libraries having loppers for brown-tail moth ready for checkout. So the same kind of thing for seed collection kits would be really cool. Seed collection and mapping is one thing I think could be expanded as we collect seed, and if we can check off that area that seed's been collected there. Not to say don't collect there, but just to say this area isn't hit. Let's see if we can collect some seed there. And then silvicultural examples in all of the forests are ash forests, not just brown ash forests, but some examples of BMPs in those forests, like the Maine Forest Service efforts to avoid harvesting seed producing ash trees. Examples and some of those silviculture walk-in talks I think would be great. And then lastly, something else to share. How can landowners provide access to brown, black ash sites to harvesters and basket makers for cultural use? I can add that APCA has been a little bit of a component there. If folks reach out to APCA, we've got connections to basket makers, and we've made that connection to facilitate harvest. But it's definitely something that we're learning as we go in terms of making that connection. And Richard and other basket makers have great input on how that could occur. And that's it for what we talked about.
That's awesome. Thank you, Tyler. It's great also seeing all this back and forth in the chat about resources. This is exactly the kind of information that we will be putting on our web hub when that gets launched. So, if you wanted to, reach out because you have seed collection kit, we could, broadcast that over the region. So that's really great to see some of these resources. I know we're at time. I think we'll just keep going for those that want to stay on. I'll also mention that if you want to keep adding to the sticky notes, feel free. There's no limit on that. So beyond this meeting, if you're like, oh, I really want this resource, just add it in and I'll go through all of that information. All right, over to David in Massachusetts.
Yeah, I'll try to go quick in the interest of time. We had a smaller group, so I basically just took notes, and I'm not even sure if they use sticky notes, but I think one of your objectives as a web hub is going to be an important one, because a lot of the information that we talked about was there's a desire to know what to do next. A lot of land trusts were there and had a lot of dead and dying ash. So the question is, what do they do in those areas where there's not any ash coming back? Do they replant? What should be replanted? There's interest in cost sharing for treatments, especially in the state of Mass. I'm not really sure that that exists yet, but there is interest in developing that. And I'd like to hear from other states at some point how that works. And then there's a desire to know like some of the newest methods that exist. They want to have a place that people can go to find that information. And this sounds like this would be that place as it develops. There's new interest and efforts on looking at seed trees and in terms of adapting forest to climate change. What do you do with ash in that context? So again, integrating the latest approaches is something that there was a desire for. And then desire and interest in MAMA that someone had mentioned. So the more that information can get out, the better. And I think I'll leave it at that in the interest of time.
Okay, thanks, David. Bill, New Hampshire.
All right. Yeah, so in New Hampshire, we talked a little bit about what some of the different land managing organizations were doing in response to emerald ash borer. I know we had Wendy with the Society for the Protection of New Hampshire Forest mentioned that they're looking at ways to try and preserve ash on their landscape through different, I've worked with them like this as a state agency with different management projects like ash treatments and biological control and that sort of stuff. Some other people mentioned things like trying to identify the more rare pockets of or stands of black ash and green ash that are kind of more ecologically unique in New Hampshire. So trying to find those and prioritize protecting them or doing management in those areas. I had mentioned some of the projects that we're doing in the state for the upcoming years are things like looking for sites to plant seedlings and try and get some local kind of seedling stock established from seeds that were collected from around the state a few years ago. And just discussing what the kind of best methods for doing that were, along with identifying sites that would be well-suited candidates for that sort of work. And that's what we covered.
All right, great, thanks. And for the national group, our last group, Christian.
Good morning. So the national group was kind of the catch-all, and so we were pretty widely dispersed. There was two of us Minnesotans, and then we had someone from Delaware and someone from New Jersey. And so we're probably coming to the table with pretty different concerns, pretty different ash resources, pretty different ecology. But I'll just start with the first question. And then like someone else said, we had a few people add to the slides because we ran out of time during our actual group. But some of the ash stewardship treatments that are actively being pursued, and I kind of tried to summarize, I think we all tried to summarize kind of what we've heard of going on in our areas. So examples would be proactive planting of non-ash trees into various forest stands, pesticide treatment in Minnesota, especially I know that's been primarily an urban phenomena. We don't have, like we learned about today in Vermont, some of the sort of non-urban environments. I haven't really heard of that going on, at least in Minnesota, very much. Seed saving and seed banking has been something that's been practiced, I know, in Minnesota for probably since 2011 or 12. A lot of those seeds being sent out to a seed vault long-term storage facility, I believe in Fort Collins, Colorado. I think some of the shelf life on some of those earlier collected seeds, they probably already expired in terms of viability. But I know that the seed saving has been an ongoing thing. It's challenging. Green ash is a reliable annual seed producer. Black ash has a lot of unreliability in terms of annual reliable seed crop. So it's always been challenging to get those seeds. Parasitoid wasp, I believe 2 different species have been tried in a couple different areas, at least in Minnesota. And I think someone in Delaware mentioned that's been a thing. I'm not sure about New Jersey. Restricted movement of firewood and wood products through quarantines and things like that have been implemented across the state for at least 10 years. A lot of those quarantine boundaries have been removed in the last year or two. I'm not completely in the loop now, but I think that they're basically gone now, as maybe the wood products industry is still a little bit restricted there. I'm a little out of the loop, but that has been something that's been done for at least a decade. In terms of resources, in New Jersey, our participant mentioned State Ag Department, Rutgers University, Bartlett Tree Services, the Northeast Urban Silvicultural Network, and then sort of more in Minnesota, things that were mentioned were the University of Minnesota's Great Lakes Silviculture Library, which is a pretty cool project. I'm not sure if that exists in other states, but basically the university reaches out to state, county, tribal consulting foresters and tries to find basically real world examples where the local forester can kind of write up something about what they've tried and how the results have been. And this is not just ash related, it's all kinds of different silviculture, but it really ends up with sort of a one-stop shop for a bunch of sort of anecdotal experiments and small scale, sort of operational scale silvicultural experiments. And as it relates to ash, this can be maybe people's trying to plant non-ash species, what kind of habitats, native plant communities they put it into, wet sites, dry sites, what kind of success they've had, things like that. They can update it as results come in over the years. Kind of a pretty cool ongoing project spearheaded by the University of Minnesota. Related to that, I know as a forester for the Fond du Lac Band for a long time, it was in meetings like this and in other meetings, it was just word of mouth. A county forester, a tribal forester, a state forester was toying with different things, different planting strategies, things like that. And so there's a lot of sort of informal knowledge that's shared that way, kind of outside of the research environment, operational scale again. There's the tree, I think it's the U.S. Forest Service's Tree Atlas as an example. State of Wisconsin has EAB guidelines you can reference. Minnesota Department of Agriculture has been very involved in invasive species work, particularly with EAB over the years. They set the quarantine boundaries in cooperation with APHIS, for example. U.S. Forest Service has some really interesting research projects in the state on the Chippewa National Forest. That's been ongoing with a lot of planting of non-ash trees. That's been really interesting, including Manchurian ash. And the University of Minnesota Extension, different master's and thesis projects, things like that have all been sort of valuable resources. It's been challenging as a field forester for years to try to figure out what's current, what's working, what's being worked on. It's challenging to stay up to date on what's sort of the best thing, what's working, and then also what's working locally, because what works maybe in Wisconsin might be not so great in Minnesota, for example, or what works in the southern part of the state might not work as well in the northern part of the state. So it's really important to have sort of those localized and regional networks of information to sort of stay abreast. Lastly, I think the last slide that we have filled out was what resources, information, and training are needed in your state and the region. Just broadly, best practices for ash preservation moving forward. So that's another example, I think, where it's hard to stay current of the most recent research and best practices. The synthesis of existing knowledge related to black ash, the current state of EAB resistant ash trees and or hybrid trees. I know that there's ongoing research with looking at resistance and trying to breed more resistance and crossing Manchurian ash with black ash to see if you can get black ash's hydrological tolerance combined with Manchurian ash's EAB resistance. And last I heard, I'm a few years out on this. It was not the greatest success so far, but the research was ongoing. So maybe there's been some improvements since then. And then lastly, just more information and research related to climate change and EAB interactions. That's especially important in northern Minnesota. Northern Minnesota's winters have historically been cold enough to keep EAB from moving across the state, as temperatures, I believe, have to sort of hit negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit for a day or two, especially with a limited amount of snow. And that is something that we rarely hit these days. And so EAB's restriction to move across the state of northern Minnesota in particular is probably slowly disappearing, and EAB is essentially, climatologically speaking, free to move across the state, unfortunately, as our winters get warmer.
Thanks for sharing those perspectives across the country. That's really cool to hear. Thanks, Christian. And it's great just to hear from all the different states and all the interest in having these conversations. So I'm going to wrap it up because we are over time, but thank you everybody for participating. A special thank you to the breakout group leaders and our speakers. I'm going to put a link in the chat to SAP-Ne's website. And as I mentioned, I'll be setting out a survey, and there'll be a place for you to add other things, resources, webinars, things that you want to see there. So thank you, everybody. And we're excited to keep you all engaged in the Sustaining Ash Partners Network.